newsreader, or newscaster, as Robin Day and Christopher Chataway were called. Robin Day in particular had a lack of deference in his interviewing technique that was quite outside the BBC's approach to this kind of thing.
In his garden, in his house in Cairo, here is President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt.
This is a British packet of ball bearings, and this is an almost identical packet of ball bearings made in Japan, a deliberate copy. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is out of order.
Well, what does the Foreign Minister have to say about it? That was my question to the Foreign Minister.
Yes, the Foreign Minister will need time to answer this kind of question. If you have this in mind, you should have given him advanced knowledge.
He didn't ask for advanced knowledge of any questions whatever.
Of course we don't, because we didn't expect you were so treacherous.
You think this is treachery to show you these packets?
Yes, this courtesy.
The man who did more than anyone to shape ITN in its early days was the editor for 12 years, Sir Geoffrey Cox.
I came into television from Fleet Street, and it seemed to me the natural thing to do was to put a journalist in front of the camera and let him talk directly to the viewers.
You didn't feel that this would in some way impugn the impartiality of news, the objectivity of it?
Well, there was always a risk of that, and we had to hammer out in the early days what were the proper limits between analysing the news and expressing opinions on it. And we had some ding-dong battles behind the scenes as to where that boundary line should be drawn.
What advantage did the idea of having a newscaster give you over the BBC News at the time?
In presentation terms, it gave us the advantage of personality. Television is a personality medium, and we were able to have the news reinforced by the personality of the newscaster.
At Alexandra Palace, the impact of Sir Geoffrey's ideas and approach to television news sent shockwaves through all its corners and corridors, and it led to changes. In effect, what had been happening at AP was an attempt, often an ingenious attempt, to try to illustrate what were basically sound news bulletins, rather than taking the medium of television first and trying to find ways of using that to present the news. A step in that direction, though, came when professional newsreaders were allowed in front of the cameras for the first time. People chosen for their ability to put words across to the public on the small screen.
In the Commons, Mr. MacLeod has said that the London busman's pay claim is to go to the industrial court without delay.
Kenneth Kendall and I shared the late-night summary, and then Robert Dougal read the first full-length bulletin.
This produced a quite formidable competition, because when the BBC decided to play the personality card, they had some formidable personalities to put into the field. And if you look at the team they were able to field then, with Bob Dougal, Richard Baker, Kenneth Kendall, and Michael Aspel, these were very able and very personable figures, and we had to fight very hard against them.
So, by the middle of the 50s, largely in response to the arrival of ITN, the BBC was beginning to get its television news operation together, helped in 1956 by two stories that put it firmly on the map. The British paratroop drop into Egypt, part of the plan to recapture the Suez Canal, divided the nation. The government of the day regarded the events as a declaration of war and insisted that the BBC should therefore give it total support. But the BBC, despite threats of a government takeover, allowed the opposition the right of reply. This, more than anything else at the time, reinforced the BBC's political independence. And the other big story of the time, the Hungarian Revolt and Russian measures to contain it, finally established television news as compulsive and necessary viewing. Night after night, pictures from Budapest had millions glued to their sets. From both the Hungary and Suez coverages, people could see for themselves, not long after it happened, the results of political decisions made on their behalf. It gave television news a much increased significance and importance, as a mass communication outlet. The only thing holding it back now was the lack of technology. But towards the end of the 50s, even that began to change. The new 16mm lightweight camera with magnetic soundtrack gave much greater flexibility to the kind of coverage crews could get. The role of the television reporter was developing. Someone who went out with a camera crew to note what was filmed, shape it, and write words to go with it. Outside broadcasts and the BBC's regional networks were also beginning to contribute.
By the late 1950s, it wasn't just technological advance which was affecting the way television news was developing. There were some pretty earth-shattering editorial changes too. The key figure now was Hugh Green, who took over from Sir Ian Jacob as Director General in 1960. And his avowed aim was to drag the BBC kicking and screaming into the 60s. He commissioned a report on television news from people experienced in television, and they produced a pretty devastating critique. The main drift was that television news should be freed from the shackles of radio news at Broadcasting House. It should have its own reporters, its own writers, its own newsroom, and be quite separate from the radio news organisation. Hugh Green's initiative, carried out by the two editors he appointed between 1958 and 1962, Stuart Hood and Michael Peacock, set television news on a quite different course.
5 seconds to go.
That new course was strengthened now by several more big technical breakthroughs.
We in television are convinced that the ability to portray immediacy, to realize what's new, what's going on, is the true significance of this new communications bridge.
Satellites provided the kind of facility that enabled not just millions, but hundreds of millions of people to share in the emotion of a single event, demonstrated most vividly at the funeral of President Kennedy in Washington in 1963. By now, the bulletins had come a long way from the original concept of a simple, illustrated summary of the news. They brought a dimension to world news that radio could never match.
The bombing pause in the Vietnam War is over. In a broadcast last night, President Johnson said that all American peace moves had been rebuffed and that he had ordered the resumption of air attacks on supply lines in North Vietnam. Our correspondent Anthony Lawrence reports from Saigon.
Targets were along the east coast. Naval pilots reported knocking out a bridge and damaging the approaches to a ferry landing not far from the town of Dong Hoi.
The Vietnam War was the big story now, and with the increasing sophistication of coverage, particularly foreign news coverage, the talk now was about how to make most use of the great increase in the amount of footage coming in from all over the world. More time, longer news programs was now a growing demand. ITN had been arguing the case for some time. But the BBC was first on the air with a full half-hour news program.
Good evening. And tonight, in France, 0 hour is 8 o'clock.
It was on Channel 2 at 7:30, and within a few weeks, in colour. The year was 1968, a year that was soon to justify the demands for the longer news format with a series of big stories.
Into the early hours of this morning. It started as a protest against the government's ban on the return to France of the student leader Cohn-Bendit. But with the first tear gas bombs from the riot police, the stage was set for a battle with all the violence of the first Paris student rebellion 2 weeks ago.
At home in 1968, the big running story of the year was also a series of huge demonstrations, in this case against the war in Vietnam. The way television news covered the demonstrations, even the fact that it covered them at all, led some to protest that it was only encouraging more of the same. It was the first sign that the messenger was being blamed for spreading the message. But the full force of that criticism was reserved for the next decade. The Grosvenor Square demonstrations were the last big stories covered by television news from Alexandra Palace. The old place had seen tremendous changes in the way the public were kept in touch with what was going on in the world. For 15 years, the men and women who'd worked at the palace had been preoccupied with getting a television news formula that would inform and attract the viewers. They'd been absorbed in the technicalities of the medium. It had all been great fun. And when Robert Dougal and I sang our farewells at the close-down party in September 1969, It was with genuine affection for the place and the people we'd worked with. The end of an era.
Now is the time to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now is the time to yield a sigh.
Yield it. Yield it.
Now the old news is going gay and joining showbiz down White City way. Goodbye, goodbye, we're leaving you, skiddly-da, goodbye. We wish a fond goodbye, fa-ta-ta-ta, fa-ta-ta-ta, goodbye.
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 Goodbye, Addy-Paddy. Why not say it again?
Yes, why not indeed?
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Joel Compass here in Television Centre. Can I have a word, please, with Richard Whitmore or George James?
Hello, this is BBC Television News. My name is Davidson. Could I speak to somebody, please, concerning a request for an interview with the Chancellor?
The move to Television Centre at the end of 1969 happened to coincide with a subtle change in the role of television news as a whole.
Thank you. Can you ask Larry Harris to give me some copy on Jackson for 145, please?
Okay, what's the next story you don't want me to do?
The newfangled toy, as television was once described by Sir William Haley, was now the nation's main source of information. And that brought with it, for the people who worked in the business, a whole new set of problems, of which by far the biggest was the situation in Northern Ireland.
I would have thought there might have been some point in having him explain this.
It looked and sounded very much like the end of the ceasefire. The army are up here in the middle of Leonardoon Avenue. They'd come together after an earlier confrontation down the end, which looked at the time like the kind of civil rights clash we knew from years ago.
The BBC faced the difficulty of how to keep the electorate informed about what was going on there, at the same time making sure that the coverage didn't make the situation worse. After all, pictures of what was happening on the streets of Belfast could be seen there at exactly the same time as they could be seen on sets on the mainland.
Him off there with the sniper rifle. If you see him, only if you see a man with a weapon there.
That's Paul.
It was a difficult, delicate, and often dangerous path, particularly for the camera teams and reporters on the streets. As the BBC's Assistant Director General, Alan Prothero, described, the responsibilities of it all weighed heavily on people who had to make the final decisions.
In terms of the 9 o'clock news, for example, it would have been possible for us to have broadcast a story at 9 o'clock and for somebody to have been killed as a result of that story at 9:15. Now, that did not for one moment give us any idea of self-censorship or accepting anybody else's censorship, but it did raise the consciousness of all the journalists in television news and indeed throughout the BBC that we had to be absolutely accurate, we had to be quite clear, and we had to put things in context. We learned a lot of lessons, all broadcasters, and I think a lot of newspaper journalists learned a great deal, a large number of lessons during the opening years of Northern Ireland. We learned very quickly to distinguish when we were being used for propaganda purposes, and we learned to analyze very clearly what the intentions were. That was a lesson that was learned very quickly indeed, and was a direct result, I suspect, of the journalist's essential stock in trade. And that has to be cynicism. It has to be a questioning, it has to be an analysis of why people are saying the things they say, as well as what they're saying.
The prospect of a national...
And that questioning of why people say what they're saying now began to be put by academics about the television journalists.
Right then, did it seem to you to be right that the miners were first in an exciting and interesting menu? I think you'd agree for that night. And what did it concentrate on?
I think it was right because it's been going for about 6 weeks.
University departments started to run courses in television news coverage. Students analyzed it, developed theories, argued about it. Here at Stirling University, the research professor, doing a 2-year study into news judgments and editorial decision-making, is the former editor of The Guardian and controller of BBC Scotland, Alistair Hetherington. What, we asked him, were people